The year is 2247. The world map, once a tapestry of diverse nations, now bore the jagged scars of a genetic war. The Ascended, as they arrogantly called themselves, reigned supreme. They were the product of a twisted eugenics program, orchestrated a century ago by a group of fanatical extremists who had seized global power. Their creation was the perfect human, physically imposing, immune to disease, and gifted with unnaturally extended lifespans. Their cold, calculating eyes were always trained on one target: humanity. The Ascended viewed the Unmodified, the baseline humans, those who had not been deemed worthy of genetic improvement, as inferior, as aberrations to be purged. They lived in opulent, gleaming metropolises where technology served their every whim. The Unmodified, on the other hand, existed in the shadows. Scattered pockets of humanity clung to life in the forgotten corners of the world, living in fear of the Ascended's relentless purges, surviving as scavengers and rebels. The Ascended were not content with mere subjugation. Their agenda was extermination. They saw the Unmodified as a disease plaguing the planet, a reminder of a flawed past that needed to be erased. Their weapons were not bombs or bullets, but insidious biological horrors, specifically designed to dismantle the very fabric of human immunity. Their campaign began, not with a bang, but with a series of silent, creeping attacks. In North America, the weapon was a cocktail of engineered viruses and peptides designed to disrupt the delicate balance of immunological tolerance. The body's immune system, normally calibrated to distinguish between self and non-self, would become hypersensitive, attacking the body's own tissues. The mechanism was complex. The weapon targeted regulatory T cells, the body's peacekeepers. These cells were essential for suppressing autoimmune responses and were responsible for controlling inflammation. Once compromised, the Unmodified's immune systems became a double-edged sword. People developed severe, often fatal allergic reactions to the simplest things: grass pollen, pet dander, even their own gut bacteria. Inflammation became chronic and debilitating, ravaging their organs and causing relentless pain. Food became a poison and life a constant struggle against internal revolt. Cities that once shone with life became graveyards of suffering, echoing with the groans of the sick and the mourning of the dying. Europe was targeted next. The attack here was subtler but equally devastating. The Ascended released a bioagent that crippled the innate immune system, the first line of defense against pathogens. Macrophages and natural killer cells, usually the first responders to any invasion, were rendered ineffective. They were either unable to recognize pathogens or incapable of launching a proper immune response. Compounding the damage, the presentation of antigens to the adaptive immune system was also compromised. Dendritic cells, the professional antigen presenters, were no longer able to prime the T cells. As a result, the Unmodified were left utterly vulnerable to common infections. The smallest cold could turn deadly. Pneumonia, meningitis, and other previously manageable diseases became unstoppable killers. The continent was swallowed in a wave of illness and death. Across Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, the third wave hit. This time, the Ascended unleashed a bioweapon that specifically targeted T-cell activation. The Unmodified immune system struggled, unable to mount an effective defense against even simple pathogens, as they could not properly prime the cytotoxic T lymphocytes and other effector T cells. Without the ability to recognize and attack infected cells, the infected became walking incubators, spreading disease to anyone who dared to go near them. This third attack had far-reaching effects, severely impairing the body's ability to adapt to new threats. In Oceania, the Ascended introduced a highly engineered retrovirus that induced a terrifying new kind of cancer. These tumors did not simply grow unchecked. They actively manipulated the immune system, turning its own defenses against itself. The tumors released cytokines that suppressed cytotoxic T-cell function, while also stimulating the growth of regulatory T-cells that would protect the tumor itself. The result was an incredibly aggressive and untreatable malignancy that rapidly metastasized, turning the body into a battleground that it could not possibly win. The Ascended watched with detached amusement, their advanced sensors and satellites tracking the slow, agonizing decline of humanity. They felt no remorse, only the smug satisfaction of their self-proclaimed superiority. But there were two continents that remained untouched by this biological carnage: Africa and Latin America. These lands had learned the painful lessons of the past. They had built their strength not through genetic manipulation, but through unity and resilience. They had pooled their resources, developed cutting-edge technology, and established a formidable defense, effectively shielding themselves from the Ascended's reach. And they had noticed the suffering. They watched the world collapse and the cries for help. They were led by Brazil, a nation that had risen from the ashes of its own past to become a technological powerhouse and a beacon of hope. They were the last hope of humanity. The first chapter was a prelude to a war for survival. The news of the Ascended's genocidal campaign reached Africa and Latin America in fragmented whispers, carried by desperate radio signals and encrypted messages smuggled through the global networks. The images, while often blurry and distorted, were enough to fuel the fire of a shared resolve. The world outside was dying. It was their duty to ensure that humanity did not follow. Africa, long scarred by exploitation and division, had finally found its footing. The various nations, having learned from centuries of oppression, had forged strong alliances, pooling their vast resources and diverse knowledge. They had built cities that were not just centers of technological advancement, but also hubs of sustainable living. Their understanding of natural systems was integrated into every aspect of their design, and their biosciences and advanced genetic engineering was employed not to alter humanity, but to improve it and adapt it to the demands of a changing planet. The leadership was committed to equity and inclusion, seeing strength in diversity and cooperation, and had developed sophisticated technological and biological countermeasures against the Ascended, making sure their immune systems were fortified. Latin America, led by Brazil, was a powerhouse of innovation. Brazil had become a leader in sustainable energy and biotechnology, developing ingenious solutions to combat global environmental challenges. They had pioneered quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and material science, and had created a network of interconnected cities that were both technologically advanced and deeply rooted in their vibrant cultural heritage. Their leadership, marked by fierce independence and a commitment to social justice, resonated deeply with their people. They had learned from their past of social and political instability and oppression, and were determined to not repeat the same mistakes, creating a society that was both prosperous and fair. The two continents formed an unbreakable alliance, united by their shared values and a common enemy. They shared technology, expertise, and resources, strengthening their mutual defenses and building a formidable counterforce against the threat posed by the Ascended. Their combined military strength was unparalleled. They had constructed powerful defensive systems, energy shields, automated weapon platforms, and advanced cyber warfare capabilities that would make any incursion by the Ascended a nightmare. They controlled the flow of information on their continents, effectively countering any propaganda attempts. In their labs, scientists raced against time to understand the nature of the Ascended's bioweapons, working tirelessly to develop effective vaccines and antidotes. Brazil took the lead in coordinating a global relief effort. They created a vast network of underground tunnels, reaching out to the desperate pockets of unmodified resistance around the world. They built hidden hospitals and research centers, providing medical aid and safe havens to those who managed to escape the Ascended's reach. They established lines of communications, using quantum-entangled communication systems that were impervious to the Ascended's surveillance. The Brazilian leadership knew that the war against the Ascended would not be won by brute force alone. They needed information, knowledge, and most importantly, the will to fight from all the unmodified. Within these tunnels and safe havens, resistance cells started to form. Led by scientists, doctors, and engineers who had managed to flee from Europe, North America, and the Middle East, the Unmodified started to replicate, refine, and adapt the discoveries made by Brazil and Africa, and began to establish a global resistance. They were fueled by a desire for revenge and a refusal to accept their fate. They communicated in coded messages and by utilizing advanced quantum encryption, coordinating small-scale sabotage operations against the Ascended's infrastructure and supply lines, striking blows whenever and wherever they could. These cells were often small and vulnerable, but they were tenacious. They were the seeds of rebellion, nurtured by the hope that the alliance between Africa and Latin America had ignited. They were the tangible proof that despite the Ascended's might, humanity was not yet extinguished. They knew they were fighting a powerful foe, but they also knew that they were not alone. The Ascended, meanwhile, remained complacent, convinced that their dominance was absolute. They saw the Unmodified as nothing more than vermin, not as a potential threat to their rule. They had no idea of the meticulous plans being laid against them under the surface, the network of hope expanding, the seeds of rebellion taking root. The stage was now set for a global revolution. The battle lines were drawn, the two sides were separated. One was of genetic perfection, cruelty and oppression, and the other of hope, resilience and unity. The continents of Africa and Latin America stood firm, ready to lead the Unmodified to victory, ready to claim back the right to exist. The underground networks meticulously built by the Alliance of Africa and Latin America began to hum with activity. The Unmodified, emboldened by the hope of a real challenge to the Ascended's tyranny, were no longer content to merely survive. They were organizing, training, and preparing for a coordinated global uprising. Brazil, acting as the central command hub, deployed its advanced quantum communication network, establishing secure links with resistance cells across the world. The information flowed freely now, maps of Ascended installations, weaknesses in their technological defenses, and vital intel about their troop movements. The Unmodified learned to exploit the Ascended's arrogance, using their belief in their own superiority against them. They understood that the Ascended, blinded by their genetically engineered enhancements, had become complacent, relying too much on technology and too little on human ingenuity. In North America, resistance cells composed of scientists, former military personnel, and ordinary citizens hardened by years of suffering, focused on undermining the Ascended's logistics and infrastructure. They sabotaged power grids, disrupted communications networks, and ambushed supply convoys, using guerrilla tactics and innovative homemade weapons. These cells also started to work on the immunologic discoveries made in Latin America and Africa, using genetic engineering tools that were smuggled through the underground network to reverse the effects of the Ascended's bioweapon attacks. It was a race against time, but they were making progress. In Europe, the resistance was more scattered, operating in small autonomous groups. They had to rely more on stealth and subterfuge. Their knowledge of the region, combined with their deep understanding of the Ascended's psychology, was their greatest weapon. They became masters of disguise and infiltration, finding ways to penetrate Ascended compounds and steal crucial data, sabotage weapons manufacturing, and gather critical intel. They also started to make progress in the reverse engineering the bioweapon used by the Ascended. Scientists with deep knowledge in immunology were leading the way in this. They knew that understanding the way the bioweapon worked was key to the development of a cure. Across the Middle East and Asia, resistance fighters utilized their intimate knowledge of the terrain, creating intricate networks of hidden tunnels and secret rendezvous points. They were highly mobile and elusive, launching hit-and-run attacks against Ascended patrols. Many were former soldiers and freedom fighters with considerable combat experience, and they used it to their advantage. They had become masters of asymmetrical warfare, turning the Ascended's technological advantages against them. In Oceania, the fight was particularly grim. The aggressive cancers induced by the Ascended's bioweapon were taking a heavy toll, but the resistance was learning, not only to mitigate the growth of the tumors, but to utilize it for its own purposes. The understanding they were acquiring on the manipulation of the immune system by these tumors allowed them to start developing new and better treatment options. Scientists started to develop novel immunotherapies that allowed them to activate the immune system to attack the tumor. The Ascended, initially dismissive of these localized skirmishes, were beginning to realize that they were facing a far more serious threat than they had anticipated. Their surveillance systems were being jammed, their supply lines were being disrupted, and their troop morale was starting to plummet. They responded with brutal force, escalating the violence and intensifying their purges. But for every one resistance fighter they killed, 2 more rose to take their place. The Unmodified were fueled by a burning rage, their determination to take down their oppressors only growing stronger. In Africa and Latin America, the leaders were now preparing for the final phase of their plan. They began to deploy a new generation of advanced defensive systems around their borders, anticipating a large-scale attack by the Ascended. They also started preparing a massive counteroffensive, ready to strike at the heart of the Ascended's empire and destroy their command centers. They were using quantum-entangled communication to make sure that the resistance cells all over the world were ready to launch a synchronized global attack. The scientists and military strategists had been working for years to put the plan in place, making sure that the Ascended were caught off guard. The world was holding its breath, poised on the edge of a decisive conflict. The oppressed, emboldened by a newfound hope and a shared sense of purpose, were rising up against their oppressors. The Ascended, confident in their supposed superiority, were oblivious to the storm that was gathering, preparing to be swallowed by the tsunami of human resistance. The battle for the future of humanity was about to begin. The coordinated global uprising began with a synchronized disruption of the Ascended's communication networks. Quantum-entangled communication systems, developed by the Alliance of Africa and Latin America, bypassed the Ascended's jamming technology, allowing the resistance cells to communicate seamlessly. The world was plunged into a chaotic battle. In North America, the resistance, armed with advanced weaponry, and fortified with the first doses of immune system rebalancing treatments developed in hidden labs, launched a series of devastating attacks on Ascended bases. They targeted key infrastructure, disabling power grids and transportation hubs. Cities that had once been monuments to Ascended dominance were now battlegrounds, filled with the sounds of gunfire and explosions. The Unmodified fought with a ferocity born of desperation, a thirst for freedom finally unleashed. In Europe, the resistance cells, having infiltrated the Ascended's inner circles, unleashed a wave of sabotage and assassinations. Key Ascended leaders were targeted, weakening their command structure. Scientists and doctors, working tirelessly in hidden labs, had managed to isolate and neutralize the bioweapons' effects on the innate immune system. They started distributing the countermeasures through the underground networks, allowing the Unmodified to fight without fear of infection. The Middle East and Asia became a theater of intense guerrilla warfare. Resistance fighters, deeply familiar with the terrain, utilized their knowledge to ambush Ascended patrols and cut off their supply lines. The Resistance, now equipped with advanced anti-armor weapons, began destroying the Ascended's war machines with ease. The Ascended, caught off guard and struggling to adapt to the unconventional tactics of the Resistance, found themselves losing ground. In Oceania, the immunotherapies developed by the Resistance began to show remarkable results. Cancerous tumors that had once seemed invincible were now shrinking, the body's immune system finally able to recognize and attack them. The Unmodified fought with renewed vigor, their bodies finally turning against the Ascended's manipulations. The Ascended responded with a full-scale military counteroffensive, deploying their advanced weaponry and genetically enhanced troops. But the tide had already turned. They were fighting a united global force, fueled by a desire for justice, freedom, and the preservation of the human spirit. The Unmodified's resolve was not matched by the Ascended's confidence, and the cracks in their seemingly impenetrable armor began to show. The Ascended were facing for the first time the combined might of a truly unified human resistance. The final battle took place in the heart of the Ascended's most fortified city. The Brazilian military, along with the African armies, launched a coordinated attack penetrating the Ascended's defenses with advanced weaponry and tactical maneuvers. The Unmodified, bolstered by their technological advances and the promise of a new dawn, fought side by side with their allies, fighting as one. The Ascended's genetically modified soldiers, once thought to be invincible, were overwhelmed by the sheer determination and ingenuity of the Resistance. The Unmodified's unity, their strategic brilliance and their overwhelming courage became the decisive weapons in the fight for their survival. The Ascended were no match for the human spirit, fortified by hope and a common goal. The battle was long and arduous, but in the end, the Resistance prevailed. The Ascended's leadership was captured, their power structure was dismantled, and their reign of terror was finally over. The remaining Ascended soldiers were disarmed and sent to re-education centers that taught the values of empathy and cooperation. The era of genetic supremacy was extinguished by the enduring power of human will. In the aftermath of the revolution, the Alliance of Africa and Latin America worked to rebuild the world. They shared their technology, knowledge, and resources with the rest of the world, helping to heal the scars of the genetic war. They established a new world order based on equality, justice, and the preservation of human diversity. The Unmodified began the long process of rebuilding the planet, working together to create a better future for all. The dystopian world had been shattered, and a new dawn had risen. The age of the Ascended was over, and the future of humanity was once again in the hands of humanity itself. The lessons learned from the conflict were not to be forgotten. Genetic manipulation had been used to subjugate and destroy, but unity and cooperation had the power to liberate and rebuild. The world had been saved by the courage and the resilience of the Unmodified, and by the unshakable bond between Africa and Latin America, who stood as beacons of hope in a world that had almost fallen into darkness. The revolution had shown the world that true strength lies not in genetic manipulation, but in the indomitable spirit of humanity. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, there was hope.